Hello and welcome to As the CMMC Churns. I'm Matt Titcomb, the CEO of Peak InfoSec, an authorized C3PAO and CMMC Provisional Assessor. Today's episode is Scope Confusion, Part 1 of 2. So, scope confusion is ongoing right now, and it's really critical we solve this. Why? Because when it comes down to it, understanding scope is your very first fundamental step to getting ready for a conformity assessment. Now, as you see our rabbit here, we got a rabbit hole that I'm going to be very tempted to go down and explain a lot more, and I'm going to stop now. But it all starts with that assessment. Now, that being said, that assessment does first start by understanding where you've got CUI and then scoping your environment. If you get these steps wrong, everything else that follows will fail. So all the confusion that is going on right now across the DoD, the Defense Industrial Base, and even with us consultants, is putting you guys at risk. So let's address that. So when it comes to scope, there's two, and this is where we're having confusion right now. We have the scope of applicability, which we're going to talk about today. And then our next part, we're going to talk about the CMMC Assessment Scope. Now, people would think that these two things are fighting and combating. They're not. There's a lot of confusion and a lot of misinterpretation going on. They're actually meant to mesh together. Fundamentally, they're meant to wrap inside one of the other. And that's where people are really getting confused right now with what is going on. So when we talk about scope authority, it really does come down to the type of system we're talking about. Now, the very first type of a system is a federal system. Now, you in the Defense Industrial Base may be maintaining this system on behalf of a federal agency. That's still a federal system. When your contract ends, they get the system back. You don't get to keep it. So that's your first tell, and that's the best way to indicate that you're in this first grouping. The second group is contract ends, you get to keep your system. That's your IT, everything you do to answer and fulfill the fundamental intent of the requirement that you've contracted with DoD or your prime or wherever you are in that supply chain. Most times, in the bulk majority of work that we've worked with clients has been on the second system. We've had some clients actually supporting the first system in their environment, but they still have to have 171 and CMMC in that foundation to support that federal system in their environment. Now, this is also where we see NIST 800-171 being applied is within the 32 CFR, the Controlled Unclassified Information Regulatory Requirement. This is where it all starts from. Now, related to that is the simple reality is that the requirement to use NIST 800-171 and 171A is a federal requirement, not a DoD requirement. There's a lot of confusion with people thinking that DoD has mandated this. DoD did not. The federal government did, and DoD is following the federal government's directions. Likewise, DoD does not have the authority to just simply change this because they want to. They can make it harder. They can make it more strict. They have done that in some areas, but they cannot deviate. They cannot make it less. Now, we are seeing confusion on this topic right now amongst the Defense Industrial Base. The DoD CIO came out and said, we want the DIB to follow NIST cybersecurity framework. It's not going to happen. Here's the simple reason why. The NIST cybersecurity framework does not meet a moderate security baseline. It was not designed to. In order to make it meet a moderate security baseline, it will have to be transformed into NIST SP 800-171. Okay, so why say it? Unfortunately, a lot of leaders do come in and they don't understand all these regulatory piece parts, and they say things And they also don't understand the consequences for the rest of the DIB and how it spins everybody off and gets everybody confused. So again, 800-171 is a federal requirement. DOD doesn't have the authority to deviate from it. That's where it is today. Anything else requires a federal change, not a DOD change. Now, likewise, following that thread, we get to NIST 800-171. If you hang out with me at any point in time and we start talking scoping, that sentence is going to come up each and every time. If you start deviating from what the scope is, that sentence is going to come up each and every time. It is that foundational, it is that important in defining your scope within the defense industrial base when you are handling the government's intellectual property. Now, the scope defines the requirements. The requirements are the 110 requirements in NIST SP 800-171 plus the 62 non-federal organization controls in the back of 171. Yep, you actually do have to meet 172. We're only going to evaluate you on 110. So again, you need to understand what the requirements are for you to properly apply them to your environment. Now, the requirements are applied to the components. Components are made up of 3 parts: people, facilities, and technologies. So when we start breaking this down and we start talking, don't get system focused. Don't think of just that little laptop. It's everything. Now, likewise, those components are broken down further into 2 types: those that store, process, or transmit CUI, and those that protect CUI. Now, this plays out as we continue going along into basically what is your scope of applicability diagram. Now, your system boundary is that big boundary. We refer to this as the internal boundary, everything the controls and requirements apply to. Again, within that boundary are the CUI components and your security protection components. Now, there is a third thing in paragraph 1.1 that is applied that we didn't bring up. That is your out-of-scope requirements. This is actually where the term external comes from. NIST 800-171 will refer to external in reference to things that are out of scope, meaning you don't have control or influence on them, or you've chosen to take them out of scope and they're not within that boundary. Little fuzzy words in there, but they're critical words that empower you. Most things we typically see with things being taken out of scope, your guest wireless. Your guest wireless is used internally, and so it's a security protection asset allowed for the networking and protecting communications, but that same system allows you to take those guests and take them out of scope because you've applied a logical access control to isolate them. Now, as an assessor, I will come in and do a negative test. Are your controls actually implemented that somebody on that guest network can't get to CUI assets that are in your internal network? So again, anything you're taking out of scope, you are subject to negative testing on. Now let's take another look at this diagram here. So when we think of breaking these assets down, pretty typical stuff we see, a very simplified version. We've got the people, we've got laptops, PCs, devices that they're using, CNC machines. Yes, CNC machines, when you send that spec to that machine, and that machine is milling a CUI part per that spec, that machine is in scope. Oh, we'll talk about this next week a little bit more. But then likewise, as you're generating QA data, you're measuring that part. Is it actually get milled right? That QA data is in scope. All of this information is typically flowing up to services up in the cloud like Office 365. So again, that's kind of a loose set of CUI assets. Now, when we look at security protection assets, Office 365 is both. Yep. It's providing you Azure Active Directory. It's providing you Microsoft multi-factor authentication. Hopefully and prayerfully, hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, you're using Defender for Endpoint up there or Defender for Cloud up there, and you're doing anti-malware scanning, spam, phishing, etc., that makes Office 365 also a security protection asset. This is pretty common to see things actually sit potentially on both sides of the fence, depending upon what they're doing. Likewise, you've got people. You've got your IT team that are managing your system, whether that's internal staff or external staff. We'll talk about that one later on too. Facilities, where all this is occurring in. And then you've got other technologies. The icon on the left is for Azure Sentinel, your security incident and event management system. The icon on the right is Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, endpoint protection, antivirus, anti-malware. That's common things that we typically run into as security protection assets. Now, when we start to step into this, it becomes really important that as you all start to look at applying your scope of applicability, you need to understand your job. Your first job is to identify all of the components and their type. When you're doing that, kind of going back to that previous slide, do it in an information-driven manner. Follow the CUI. You can get CUI starting as early as the business development phase. You put in a proposal, your business development team is now handling CUI, and it starts there. Go all the way through to the end of your contract. And at the end of the contract, you're still having to maintain information for a period of time afterwards. You still have to maintain it as CUI. You're not allowed to just suddenly decontrol it and give it away. So again, you need to follow the CUI through its entire life cycle in your environment. As you do this, you're going to figure out what you can descope and move in, move out. Do so wisely. Do not over descope without really documenting and explaining why. If you do, you fail to provide adequate security protection. That's on you. Not me as the assessor, not on DoD. That was your decision. So again, think through that, document it wisely, and pick and choose appropriately. Now, once you've done all this, apply that scope to all components. Make sure you understand what your CUI assets, security protection assets, and out of scope, and apply the requirements completely. As you do so, make sure you're following DFAR 7012. There are enhanced requirements in DFAR 7012 for cloud service requirements that are above and beyond what is required in 800 to 171. You're in scope to provide that. I will evaluate that as an assessor because failure to do so is failure to protect CUI. That's why we're auditing you. Likewise, as you do all this, make sure you're documenting all this in your system security plan. That is the place where you're trying to maintain all of this. That system security plan can reference other external things, and when they're provided to us in total, that's good. You can also do everything's in the kitchen sink mode and dump it all in the system security plan. I actually don't like that. To me, that's an operational security issue. That plan is made too easy to walk, and the next thing you know, you've lost it. Now, as a hint, if you're dealing with any ISO 9000 or ISO 27000 certifications, that system security plan is kind of equivalent to a statement of applicability underneath ISO 27000. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're maybe working that path concurrently. And I've said it a couple times, apply all NIST 800-171 components to all requirements. That's people, facilities, and technologies. Why? Well, we'll talk about it next week. But DoD's CMMC Assessment Scope is causing confusion that is getting people to not apply requirements, and that's only going to get you into trouble. So again, we'll see you next week for As the CMMC Churns. I'm Matt Titcomb from Peak InfoSec, and thank you for joining us.